Hello, everybody. My name is Georg Ringe, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this event. It's the first event this semester on our LFT, Law, Finance, and Technology project at the University of Hamburg. It's great to have so many of you here. We were desperately planning to have at least a little bit of a physical event, but due to current developments, that wasn't possible. So we're back to Zoom and we try to make the most of it. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Edmund Schuster from the London School of Economics. He is a leading expert on law and technology, writing a lot about all sorts of tech research papers, various aspects. And the talk today has this nice and slightly provocative title of Cloud Crypto Land, Why Blockchain Won't Change the World. And we're all curious to hear why we're all so mistaken with our assumptions. But I'm sure that you will tell us in a moment. Just to remind everybody of the rules of the game, you are welcome to switch on your video if you like to. There's no need, obviously, and please bear in mind that the event is recorded, so you may not want to, but you are welcome to show your face. However, we would ask you to please switch off your microphone when you're not speaking, right? And we'll of course switch you on when you have a question or something. On the question thing, it's great to ask questions. We have ample time for Q&A after the talk. If you have a direct, immediate question while Edmund is speaking, then you can just send me a chat message or use the Q&A function in Zoom, and then we'll try to build you in. But as I said, you know, Edmund will speak for 20 minutes and there is ample time for questions afterwards. So the more fundamental question, I think we better keep for later. Okay, that's all for me now. Edmund, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Georg. Georg, yeah, exactly. So I need to share my screen now. Does that work? Can you all see my screen? All good?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, fantastic. Great. So thank you very much, Georg, for having me. I would have very much enjoyed to come to Hamburg, but I completely understand, obviously, that in the current circumstances, this is not possible. Now, the paper I want to present today is about blockchain technology and its interaction with the legal system. And I focus on how blockchain technology faces, in my view, fundamental limits when it comes to using it for anything that has to interact with our current legal system. And I'll also discuss how these problems can be overcome and whether we should try to overcome them. Now, the paper is forthcoming in the Modern Law Review. I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on the paper and any comments, because I'm currently kind of pondering what else there is to say about this topic and whether I have something interesting to say about it. So just a quick overview. I want to give you an overview of blockchain technology, not on the technical side. I discussed that earlier with Georg, and he thinks most of you are sufficiently familiar with blockchain technology. I just want to give you kind of a functional view of blockchain technology from the view of a lawyer, from the view that enables me to then develop my argument. And so I'll talk a bit about decentralization and the law, and I'll then present what I believe is a very simple, you could say, primitive argument about how blockchain technology and crypto assets in particular are just not feasible as long as you want them to comply and be compatible with our legal system. In order to make this argument, I will present blockchain technology as solving a decentralization problem but at the same time introducing what I call a synchronization problem between the state of a digital ledger and the legal system. I will also hopefully have time to talk briefly about smart contracts. I think really this is the area where perhaps I could expand the paper a bit more, or probably write another paper on that. Okay, so my starting point is, and this is a very basic starting point, that I compare peer-to-peer transactions in different parts of our, you could say, legal world. Now, if you look at the physical world, so think about an Apple, think about a mobile phone. So if we're in the physical world, then we could say the value of an object is largely, perhaps not always completely, but largely embedded and embodied in the physical object itself. Now, this is no surprise to any lawyer, of course. It means that if I have an apple and I give you the apple, I transfer the value directly to you. And we can therefore say there is a peer-to-peer transaction. We don't need any other party involved in that transfer. And we don't really have to worry too much about double spending. So you don't have to worry about me transferring the apple to both you and somebody else, because if you have the apple, then I have transferred the value to you. And you could say the laws of physics enforce no double spending. Now, of course, there are rules in every legal system about promises to transfer something physical to more than one people, more than one person, but that's not really that important. Virtually all legal systems acknowledge that it's very useful to look at possession as something that is so correlated with what we believe are legal rights, or should be legal rights, that we just make use of them and say, well, possession should have some meaning for the legal world. Now, think about digital assets, or really any intangibles, any legal right. Now, we use a lot of the same language when we talk about intangibles. We say, you know, somebody stole the movie, and somebody pirated a movie or something like that. But obviously, it's not quite the same as with physical objects, because a digital representation of anything is not unique. It cannot be unique. And that is really something very useful for us. It means that if I send an email to Georg with my paper, and then I say, well, actually, I sent you the wrong version. Can you send me the email back, please, so I can send you the right version? Georg would rightly believe that I'm just a bit of an idiot, right? Because there's no loss of possession over my document when I email it over to Georg. Now, this is similar to what happens in the world of intangibles, and that really includes all sorts of legal rights. Any legal promise, any right that is not a property right in a physical asset, has similar features. It means that the promise itself, the legal right itself, because it's not embodied in a physical object, and as long as it's not embodied in a physical object, there is just no way of ensuring that there's no double spending. I can, you know, assign my right to receive rent from Georg, who lives in my apartment, to more than one person in the room, and there's no obvious way for you to know whether I've done so or not. Now, what that means for legal rights, but also what it means for the digital world more generally, is that traditionally we can do one of two things. We can say, let's have peer-to-peer transactions, but then we really need to trust each other at least a little bit. I can assign my right to receive rent from Georg to Pedro, and Pedro will not know for sure whether I've assigned previously the same right to somebody else. But as long as he trusts me a little bit, we can have this peer-to-peer transaction, and it can work generally. The alternative would be that we set up some sort of a central authority, a central ledger, somebody who keeps track of all sorts of legal rights. And then we don't have to trust each other anymore. We only have to trust the central authority, because we could then have a rule that says, the rights to receive rent have to be registered, and I can only transfer them by updating, having the central ledger updated. And so I can then have a transaction between me and Pedro can easily verify whether I actually have transferred my rights to somebody else before, because the central ledger is then the authoritative source of what happens to my rights. Now, sorry for this very basic introduction. Now, the reason I present it in this way is because I think a useful way to look at blockchains is that they create an additional way of doing peer-to-peer transactions in assets, in the wider sense, that have no physical embodiment. They essentially solve the double spending problem that is the reason for us having to choose between 1 and 2 for non-physical digital assets. Now, I find it useful to think about a blockchain simulation. And so imagine, I know that many of you will be a bit too young to understand this, but this is a fax machine. And so imagine we had a system of distributing fax machines that unrealistically, I completely accept, have the following great feature. When I fax a document to anyone, the machine guarantees that the original is shredded, made unusable in the process of sending. So I send the document to Georg. Georg receives the document, and as it is sent through to Georg, my copy of the document is reliably completely destroyed. Obviously, that's technically impossible, and so on and so on, but let's assume that's possible. Now, if that were possible, imagine what great things we could do. We could say, for instance, we don't need banks to transfer money, because if it's really true that we can reliably transfer those documents in a way that they are not replicated, there would be no good fundamental reason why we shouldn't be able to just fax banknotes between each other, right? I fax a banknote to Georg. There would be little resistance to a rule that says, as long as we can rely on the authenticity and so on, that, you know, when I send a fax a banknote to Georg, he has the banknote, and his copy, his printout of the banknote is the banknote, right? So we could have a peer-to-peer financial system if only we could, we could have a peer-to-peer financial system that works by, or that includes the right to digitally transfer value without the need to have any central party, right? Now, if you're not interested in the technology, I think this example can be useful in the sense that it, in my view, embodies everything that blockchain technology really does. It allows you to do exactly that thing. It allows you to replicate my fax machine just without the paper and without the clunky machine. So it creates a way of transferring digital information in a way that solves the double spend problem, that ensures that I'm not able to use the original that I send over twice. Now, in that sense, blockchains can be said, just like my fax machine, to just replicate features of the physical world. I transfer something to you, and by transferring it to you, it's a peer-to-peer transfer. You have the digital asset in the same sense or in the same way as you would have the Apple that I transfer to you, right? That is great. There's a small disadvantage that you have to be online for it. So it's not quite the same as the Apple that I can give to you on a, you know, when we go trekking in the mountains or something like that. But other than that, that's fantastic. And it also, if you think back about the previous slide, how we can transfer those intangible assets, it has the potential, therefore, to replace central registers. Now, for lawyers interested in history, they will probably say, well, that's nothing new. We've been there before. Now, think about negotiable instruments and the history of negotiable instruments. One way to look at what happened with the early securities, with early negotiable instruments, was really that a bunch of merchants decided to take something that's intrinsically worthless, just a piece of paper, And then they said, let's just all agree on this collective illusion that legal rights, something intangible, is represented fully by that piece of paper. And if only we do that, then we can make use of all the useful features of the physical world, also for our intangible world. So in a way, when we establish negotiability, so when legal systems around the world accepted this game among merchants that we will pretend that the paper is actually not a piece of paper, but is actually a full embodiment, a representation of the right, you could say that is an early version of what is now sometimes discussed as code is law. Right? We don't care about the normal rules about assigning rights and all the conditions. What we care about is, and what we will ask you about is simply, do you have the piece of paper? If you have the piece of paper, then Pedro owes you money. I don't have to ask about all the reasons why and how the assignment worked. You have the paper, and that is proof that you have the right. Now, obviously, in the case of negotiable instruments, we've created a bunch of exceptions, so we can't go to Pedro and force him to sign a piece of paper that is then a negotiable instrument and then I transfer the piece of paper to Georg and Pedro suddenly owes money to Georg. We have created exceptions to ensure that unjust results don't occur too often. Okay, so back to crypto assets. In the paper, I distinguish between two types of crypto assets. I say, well, they are naked blockchains or naked crypto assets. And these naked crypto assets are cryptocurrencies in the narrow sense. I don't believe that I have a lot of useful things to say about cryptocurrencies in this narrow sense where, like in the case of Bitcoin, there simply is nothing else that needs to happen as a consequence of a transaction on the blockchain. If I want to transfer a blockchain to you, everything is embedded in the protocol itself. What I want to do is transfer a digital token, and what I'm doing is exactly that. There is no correlation between what happens on the blockchain and what happens in the rest of the world. It's a bit like, in our example, the merchants start caring, really deeply caring about the actual pieces of paper rather than anything they represent. So they just start, trading these pieces of paper that have no other meaning. In that case, I think my argument will not apply. There are other examples where the same is true. Decentralized storage, there's this project, for instance, Filecoin, where to a large extent everything happens within the computer system itself. There are also games like CryptoKitties and so on. But for all other tokens, and really the blockchain applications most people get excited about, especially lawyers get excited about, and that includes categories like stable coins and security tokens. In all of these cases, the tokens represent something. They stand in for something else. And my argument is simply that this type of crypto asset must somehow be tethered to legal reality, because otherwise it cannot fulfill its purpose. So my very simple central argument, it's really, I think, primitive. And so if you have any quarrels with any of the points I'm making now, then I'm very happy to discuss those. It's really three statements. First, if you have any crypto asset that represents legal rights, then you need to ultimately rely on the legal system to enforce those rights, because otherwise they are not legal rights and you can't enjoy them. The second point is every legal system places certain limits on what can be agreed. There are multiple, I'm sure all of you have examples in mind. There are certain agreements that will never be given effect to by the legal system because of fraud, because I put a gun to Pedro's head in order to make him sign a transaction or something like that. Now, the final point is that these legal rules are just too complicated for any formal algorithmic system to fully embed them. There is no technological solution that can ensure that while Pedro is signing the transaction, he's not under duress by me. A computer cannot decide that. So because this cannot be solved in code, if you have something that is tethered to legal reality, you need a system to realign the state of your digital ledger, the state of your blockchain, with the legal system. Now, what happens if you don't do that? Well, if you don't do that, then you have a situation where the state of the blockchain, so in a way, loosely speaking, the ownership structure of your assets as shown on the blockchain, and the state of the real world, which is really the legal world when we talk about legal assets, will start to slowly drift apart. I hold a gun to Pedro's head, he signs a transaction. Now, from the viewpoint of the legal system, no transaction has occurred, but on your blockchain, a transaction has occurred. Over time, your central register will drift apart from the actual state of the world. But if you know that this happens, if you know that there's a good chance of that happening, then your whole system very quickly loses its value, because people can no longer rely on the state of your blockchain representing anything of value. They need to introduce all sorts of checks, which includes a lot of questions about, trusting other people with their transactions.
Edmund, can I just, on this third point, what you mean is what economics usually tend to classify as incompleteness, that as well, no? Like our incapacity to foresee all the future contingencies and so on.
That is a very good point, Pedro. I'm not even there. So this happens at an even more basic level. I'll come to the incomplete contract if I have time. That is an additional problem. But here, the statement is really very simple. So the question would be, so let's say the legal system says, I cannot have transactions, I will not give effect to transactions that were signed by a completely drunk person. There is no reliable way to embed into your blockchain protocol a way to check whether the person signing a transaction is sober enough under the applicable law to transact. There's just no way to do that. Now, my example with how drunk you are is probably one of the closest to something that has a technical solution. I don't think there is a technical solution, but there at least you could imagine it. But think about duress. Right? There's no way for the computer to know what implicit threats exist between, in the relationship between me and you that I could use to make you sign a transaction. There's just no way to do that. So I hope that answers your question. It's even more basic at this point. Okay, now what can we do? There's an obvious, very easy fix for that, and we're kind of done. We just give the state a super key. We say, judges, the court system has a super key that can override the blockchain and can rectify the blockchain. Fantastic solution, and we're all done. The problem is it makes the blockchain completely pointless. That would mean you create a blockchain which is ultimately a slow and inefficient inefficient database, and then by giving the state a super key, you re-centralize it. And therefore, you create a system that you could have created much cheaper, much easier without any blockchain. So even if we were to somehow dramatically, technologically improve blockchain technology, you would never have a situation where it's better and easier to have a blockchain system than any other available database system. This is really equivalent to me saying, or anyone saying, let's write all contracts in red ink. My counter argument would be A, it doesn't change anything, and B, red ink is more expensive than black ink. If you now tell me, well, maybe we can make red ink cheaper, that wouldn't change anything fundamentally about the idiocy of that proposal. Now, so if that's not a solution, maybe we can choose a law. Maybe we can choose a very crypto-friendly law. Now, unfortunately, that also doesn't work because of ordre public limitations in choice of law. So if a crypto friendly jurisdiction were to give full effect to any transfer on the blockchain, including a transfer to which I force Pedro by holding a gun to his head, every or almost every system of private international law would say it is against ordre public to allow the choice of law of that crypto-friendly jurisdiction, or to give effect to that choice of law in this situation. So it doesn't change anything. You could have, some people have suggested, well, we can have oracles, and oracles would keep track of the decisions of judges and then somehow import those decisions into the blockchain. But this is equivalent to A. It doesn't make a difference whether you have a court reporter updating the blockchain or the court itself. Garbage in, garbage out, it's exactly the same a problem. And then you can have adjudication on the blockchain or governance solutions or anything like that. The problem with that is you're now on a spectrum between just trusting another institution. So you can trust the adjudicators on the blockchain, but then you have a centralized system, and you should ask yourself, why not let the adjudicators run the database? Or it's, you know, sometimes you adjudicate, sometimes you don't, and you are somewhere in between. But where you're sometimes in between, that always introduces the risk that your blockchain will not fully reflect the legal system. So this is just not solvable technologically, in my view. And so my point then is that you can kind of, the trade-off in crypto assets is between having a pointless system that is essentially centralized, or having a useless system that is decentralized but deviates and drifts apart from the legal system. And governance kind of being the trade-off in between, where you can have a bit of pointlessness and a bit of uselessness. Now, I'm mindful of time, so I'll speed it up a bit. Could we fix that legally? Of course we could, right? We could have a law that says code is law. We could say whatever happens on the blockchain, we will give effect to. Now, in order for this to work, we would have to endorse the blockchain state of the world almost absolutely, because otherwise we have the same drifting apart problem. My deep suspicion is that this is very unlikely to happen, and I've reviewed a number of kind of blockchain-friendly private laws, and all of them are a far cry from giving full effect to blockchain transactions, because, let's face it, it would be crazy for any legislator to say we will give effect to transactions even if they are so fundamentally counter our system of justice and equity, just for the benefit of enabling blockchain. So imagine a legislator deciding that a transaction that Pedro signed with a gun to his head should be given effect to, right? So that's unlikely to happen. However, you could say, well, maybe, you know, other innovations like smart contracts and so on, they just offer so big an advantage that we could move somewhat in that direction. Now, I describe in the paper, I try to make clear in the paper why this is just not likely and not, it doesn't reflect the state of the world we're in. Now, I assume most of you are lawyers. Bad news for you. Most people think that we are kind of a waste of time and space. So if you look at technologists, the implicit problem with these smart contract solutions is that they are based on the view that lawyers spend their time enforcing crystal clear obligations. That it's all kind of, we are pushing paper around, and with just a few lines of code, we could all have that much easier and kind of solved in a technological way. Now, I have two replies to that. The first is, there are indeed situations where natural language is not very good in expressing what we want to do. I've personally worked on transactions where we just said, you know, this is going to be calculated in accordance with the Excel sheet that is attached, right? Because sometimes it's easier. I've written agreements where we say, you know, this is calculated in the following way, and then you use a mathematical formula. Yes, sometimes precise kind of algorithmic language is good, but for the vast majority of cases, it simply is not. apart from that, you just don't need a blockchain to have algorithmic expressions in your contracts. You could do that. That is available to everyone. And so I think proponents of smart contracts should pause and ask themselves, why haven't lawyers been using that more extensively? It's certainly not, I believe, because we're just, as lawyers, too stupid to use mathematical or code language. Now, one argument for smart contracts is that they are self-executing. The fact is, I've discussed that with many people. Nobody can give me an example of any truly self-executing contract. Even the simplest of contracts, a bond, is impossible to design in a truly self-executing way, because the only way you can have a truly self-executing bond is a bond where I give money to somebody, they leave it in an account without touching it until the time where the money is due. Well, I don't know of many people who are interested in borrowing money just to have it sit in a locked account. For every other transaction, you just can't have a self-executing a contract as long as that contract is supposed to somehow interact with the real world. Now, I also make a more general point about legal language. And there's a trade-off between how complex your expression is, how complex the situation is you deal with, and the precision of your expression. So if you think about physics is very precise in its expression, but it's just fairly useless for most common world problems. Yes, I can describe very precisely the chance of finding a photon in a certain location, but you can't use physical language to explain how likely it is that, you know, Tesla sells more shares. That is not a problem that is expressible usefully in physical language. And so I try to make the argument that our legal language, legalese, is something that has developed over centuries and is a language that occupies, likely, I believe, a sweet spot between too rigid a language, like, you know, mathematical equations that don't allow us to express anything that is complex and therefore useful, and the kind of everyday language, the casual language, where I say to Georg, let's go for a beer, right? Legal language is somewhere in between. It's precise enough to create enforceable and kind of objectively interpretable agreements on the one hand, but it's flexible enough for me to be able to say, I will use all reasonable efforts to do something that is completely unexpressible in any formal, more formal language. So I think that is something that you need to take into account. Yeah.
Just a process of time, so maybe you can.
Yes, I'm wrapping up. I'm just my last point. Why do these blockchain projects always sound so great? I think it's due to what I call the junior business consultant fallacy. You look at a problem that exists in a system that has grown over a long time, and then you say, well, look, if we were to all switch to a blockchain system, then things would be much better. And the answer is yes, of course they would. But switching to any system would always be better. Switching, my go-to example is switching the entire financial system, every banking system, to a hardware that is basically a Game Boy from 1995 or something like that, would also improve efficiency. Not because the hardware is good, just because everyone would be using exactly the same software, exactly the same hardware, and things get more predictable. Now, change is just hard. It's always easy to say, let's all start from scratch and let's all use a blockchain. And that is not an argument for anything. The question is, if you could get everyone to change the way they're doing things, is blockchain then the best system for doing it? And I've not come across any problem where the answer to that would be yes. So I don't think I need to go through the conclusions. I think I've expressed sufficiently clearly that I'm still not entirely convinced of the promise of blockchain technology, and I'm very happy to take your questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Edmund. That was terrific talk and a very, very thought-provoking argument, very clear argument, I think, very forceful point that you make against it. So we're switching now to a discussion format. Could I ask you to take down your slides so that we have everybody on the screen? Everybody's welcome to switch on your video screens, in particular those who would like to ask a question. Please do come in. There are several ways of raising my attention. You can either use the chat function in the bottom of the screen. You can send me a personal message or something to everybody, or you can just also raise your, your physical hand like this, and then we see to get everybody who has something to say on board. All right, so first I've just seen, Federico wants to ask a question. Are you there, Federico?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Hello.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Edmund, and
hi, Fede. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Although I'm a little bit in dark. I hope to see you see me a little bit. But anyway, so I'm in at home, so it's not perfect. So just a question. Terrific paper. Thank you, Edmund. Because so if I understand correctly, your main argument is so it doesn't work. We should not trust blockchain technologies too much. So it's at some point you make a very interesting and thought-provoking parallel with the negotiable instrument and the history of this of negotiable instrument in the Middle Age. So you mentioned the Lex Mercatoria, and we all know how it has been developed over the centuries, more or less across the 11th and 12th century, so in Europe. But then my question is, do you think that such a development, a similar development might occur for blockchain technology also? So I agree with your conclusion. So I personally probably my gut feeling is that I don't trust these new things, probably because I don't understand them too much. So, but it's my problem. But at the same time, I take your argument, then your parallel with the negotiable instruments seriously, and then I was thinking maybe we are in a situation, in an historical point in which we are seeing something new developing, and in a couple of centuries there will be some regulation taking blockchain or some smart contract for granting and regulating them in an efficient way, the same way we do regulate our legislation today in all countries regulate negotiable instruments. And probably under the perspective of the first glossatori and the lawyers of the 11th or 10th century, the first negotiable instruments look very similar to blockchain, because at the end of the day, you don't sell a right, you sell a piece of paper, it's written that you have a right. What's the magic? That's magic. In the Roman law, there wasn't anything like that. You should sell the right, you should transfer the right or sell an asset. The combination of the two is magic. So, and probably, I don't know, but I would wonder now whether the lawyers from the 10th or 11th century here in Bologna, what they were thinking about the first negotiable instrument. I don't know, honestly. I'm not.
No, I think I completely get your point.
Maybe we are seeing a transformation that could lead to an efficient regulation of this, similar to negotiable instruments now. I don't know.
So absolutely, I think I mean that's the reason why I introduce a negotiable instrument into the paper and into the argument. And the main difference, and I think the unsolvable obstacle is that in relation to negotiable instruments, yes, there was a bit of a struggle. Initially, judges didn't want to acknowledge that at all because they said, well, what you're transferring is rights. And the fact that you just have the piece of paper in your hand is not enough. you have to comply with all the formalities and so on. And they've moved away from that. However, it was always possible, and it's still the case, that we just make certain reservations to it. Now, that is easier to do in the case of negotiable instruments, because we can say, yes, if I forge Federico's signature on the negotiable instrument, no legal obligation has been created, right? That is easier to do than on the blockchain, where if I somehow guess your password, then I can effect those changes. And there's just no way for those assets that continue to live on the blockchain as they are being transferred. There's no way to rectify the status of the blockchain unless you create a separate kind of correlation layer that is run by the state. And this is actually being done now in relation to cryptocurrencies, where certain blockchain tokens are basically being flagged up as illegal, as coming from an illegal source and so on. And then there are technological solutions to get around this. But so you see that the situation is very, so it's not possible to fully replicate without centralization. Maybe I can give you a more high level argument. You can choose between one of two things. You can choose the rule of law, or you can choose decentralization. You can't have rule of law without hierarchy, and you can't have decentralization with hierarchy. So the two are fundamentally, in my view, incompatible.
Edmund, let me try to push this a little further. So your main point is that there's this divergence between any blockchain power transaction, and that may diverge from the underlying assets that, you know, because of your famous gun to your head. And I'm just thinking, don't we have that sort of divergence already now? It's completely outside of any technological world, right? In certain situations where we give we attach more importance to legal certainty of the transaction. For example, in things that come to mind are bills of lading, you know, that whenever there is a formal form that's been filled in with a signature, then the sort of lading is being transferred to the recipient, or share registers, or I don't know, or real estate as well, you know, and so there's always a correction mechanism in the second place. So you can always have this sort of being rectified, or you could, and this is maybe a point to think about, if you're super interested in having precedence for the sort of transaction itself, then you could just have a second correction mechanism, which is just about damages, right? So you could say the transaction itself remains valid, whatever happens, because we think it's so fundamental to have this trust of the third party to rely on this transaction. But we open up the way of, you know, either rectifying this, which I understand you don't like, but the second avenue might be to simply ask for a damages claim to compensate. And isn't that a way how the legal systems always try to cope with that sort of problem?
So I think the fact that you can't rectify directly creates the biggest security problem. So now you can ask yourself why nobody actually tries to hack State Street or something like that, right? The reason is, if I hack into the servers of any big custodian of securities and I transfer in their system 60% of all Apple shares to myself, I'm not a billionaire. I'm an idiot who's going to prison in the best case, right? So the fact that I change an Excel sheet somewhere to reflect, to show that I'm the owner, is just useless to me, right? It's ultimately useless because you can rectify, because everyone will say, yes, usually we say this Excel sheet shows us who owns shares. However, we have been hacked, so let's, you know, roll back and everything's good. Now, we've had that too, right? We've had that with Ethereum, with the first kind of large decentralized attempt to create something like a fund or company. This happened, and then you had to rely on people voting in favor of that. But you can't always rely on the behavior of users of the system to create the only solution that would be acceptable to the legal system. And the damages claim in this example would just not be feasible, right? Because the moment you have somebody who makes these illegal transfers, as long as there's a way for this person to extract some value, there's no way to get the money back from that person, right? So you would then have to create a system. I don't think that would be acceptable to anyone. A system where you're the shareholder of Apple, somebody hacks into some computer system, and now that person is the shareholder of Apple and can give good title, can transfer good title to the next person. And all you get is a damages claim. I don't think that this would generally be acceptable. We have accepted that in very, very limited circumstances, right?
That question of how good you manage to do the system, right? And I don't know, creativity can imagine lots of also technology-driven solutions, maybe. Yeah, I don't know, of market surveillance or something. But I take the general point. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you could probably mitigate the risks, but you have to. You do have, I believe, to ask yourself for these kinds of transactions, if you then need to fix them in a way that relies fully on legal judgment, then you are putting yourself in a position where you create a problem where there was none. And then you have an elaborate system to solve half of it. I just don't see the value proposition of that.
Okay, we don't want to keep this up for too long because there are many questions out there. Just one final sentence. Your argument reminds me a little bit of was always put forward now against these self-driving cars. So there are people who claim that we'll never have fully autonomous driving cars, because if you had a fully self-driving car, then everybody could just step in front of the car, and the car would have to brake because the programmation of the car would never be in a way that they will override anybody who's just standing in front of the car. It's a little bit so attacking the weak spots of that. But I leave the scene now and have somebody who raised the hand with the name of Knut something, Knut Phone.
Hi there, this is Michael Braunschweig speaking. Thank you, yes.
Okay, you appear as Knut Phone on the screen.
Yeah, it's my iPhone's designation, sorry.
Could you switch off your screen, please?
Sure, hang on.
Okay.
Greetings. Hi. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation and the informative presentation of the paper in general. I just wanted to ask or make a couple of points and ask some questions with regard to this. First of all, I was just wondering if seemingly this technology from a legal perspective is so doomed, why are all the American investment banks investing so heavily in this technology to ensure that they have either a bilateral trading system or a bilateral single source of truth for some of their security instruments? And if I'm looking at Clearstream and some other providers of global nodes, this seems to be the future in the way in which certain matters are stored. The one criticism I would like to remark at this point is the fact that the absolutist point of view that is being taken here is not actually reflective of what is technologically being done with distributed ledger technology. It's merely a new digitization of an Excel table. It's not supposed to be as absolutist from a legal perspective as seems to have been the force or the thrust of the argument in your paper, given the fact that what happens at the end of the day is to ensure that two parties can rely on a storage technology that cannot be manipulated as easily as, for example, Excel tables that are held individually at two financial institutions. And maybe one of the arguments that I would like to put forward in that regard as well is the bearer shares. If bearer shares are stolen and you cannot identify the thief of these, the fact of the matter is that the shares or the bearer shares themselves are still constitutional of ownership of these, of the shareholding. And only by way of publication of the theft can you ensure that other parties in the market are aware of the fact that the actual owner of the shares is no longer, or the holder of those shares isn't the owner of the interest that underlies the paper that embodies the right within it. Yeah,
Exactly.
so these are the 2 points that I would like to make first of all, and would like to hear your reply on this.
Thank you. So first on your latter point, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. I think my response would be exactly right. So we have a system, Kraftlosserklärung. We have a system in most systems by which we can ensure that these bearer instruments are no longer valuable. The only way to reliably implement that on a blockchain is, again, to have a system whereby the state, because ultimately it's a legal question whether or not these instruments should be made void, whereby the state can interfere with your protocol. Now, if the state can interfere with your protocol, it's pointless. And that leads me to the second, to your first point. Now, I want to emphasize, I'm not saying at all that it cannot be done, right? It can be done. The question is whether it can usefully be done in a way that actually makes or takes advantage of the innovation, the technological innovation of blockchain. And my answer to that slightly differently put question is no. So I talk about blockchains in name only in the paper. And what you describe is absolutely, that exists, right? So 2 investment banks can set up a blockchain-like system, a DLT ledger, to keep track of transactions, derivatives transactions between them. However, in order to set up this joint project, they will probably trust each other to a certain extent. And when they trust each other to a certain extent, it would be equally easy for them to set up a joint venture that runs the ledger, where they are not worried about any manipulation by their jointly appointed employees. And ultimately, that's really what they're doing, right? That's really what they're doing, because this is the type of enterprise blockchain where if Goldman and JP Morgan get together and say, well, that was really a stupid transaction because our 2 drunk traders have made a complete mess, they can rewind all of it. It is technologically trivial to publish proofs of non-manipulation of any database, even of an Excel sheet. This is technologically trivial and has been available forever. Now, I actually say in the paper that I think the potential real value of blockchain technology is the following. You can get people excited about their back office. You can get them excited about the technology underlying their trading systems. And if they coalesce around any system, even a DLT system that is kind of a bit pointless, fantastic, right? I'm all for it, because it means that we reduce transaction costs. We just have to keep in mind that these transaction cost reductions are not linked logically to technological advantages of blockchain technology, but that they are just linked to it behaviorally. People get excited about blockchain technology, then they invest in relationships where they harmonize systems, they invest in the technology, they invest in the hardware, and then you have an advantage. Fantastic.
Okay, a further question comes from Artur Bogutsky, who asked me to read out the question to you. So the question is, Edmund, whether you have considered the validity of using psychological phenomena of the warm body effect in your analysis, considering the issue of switching from inefficient lawyers, pushing papers and replacing them with lines of code.
Sorry, can you read out the first part of it? I think.
Arthur, did you want to explain this a little bit yourself, or?
Sorry, I acoustically didn't understand the first part about warm bodies. I wasn't entirely sure.
The warm body effect. So whether you have considered the validity of using psychological phenomena of the warm body effect.
I have to admit, I'm not familiar with the warm body effect, but I'm very happy to learn about it. Sorry, who asked the question?
Yeah, apparently the internet connection of the participant is not stable enough. So maybe then we can shift this to a bilateral conversation later on by email, and move next to Bruno. There's Bruno in the chat. you want to ask your question yourself, or would you like me to read it out? Apparently read it out. So the question or the comment is, you seem to ignore that blockchain can be embedded in applications handling permissioning, authentication, rectifications, and all those properties not native to blockchain.
Absolutely, and I mean that is a valid point. However, if you step back, then I think it will become very clear in a moment to you that yes, those systems, those external systems that exist, they can be used to interact with the blockchain and take away some of the problems and disadvantages. But then ask yourself, if this is not a blockchain system, who's doing the authentication? And the answer is, you now have to trust, you just have to trust somebody else, right? You have to trust the certificate issuing authority. You have to trust whoever authenticates your users to do what you expect them to do. Now, if you are prepared to do that, there's just absolutely no reason to use this system. You found somebody you love, you found somebody you trust, fantastic. Let them run your ledger for you. We've been doing that forever.
Okay. And then Pedro, you had another question, I think?
Yes, I had a question, and I think it's quite interesting, the last one, because maybe fits on my question. Like the second part of the paper, I quite like, because we try to really clarify which is the core point of having a blockchain or not. So it's the solution to the double spending of the copy of what we are transmitting or not. And some of the previous questions kind of related to that. There's like benefits that are sold as part of the blockchain revolution, part of the smart contract movement. Like I think the question that we might not have understood probably was the psychology, like maybe human bias and things like that. That moving to a digital economy, maybe we have less bias. The one body effect, maybe something related to that. And the other question as well. So and then you kind of disentangle those points. No, we have benefits on like that are sold as part of the blockchain, but are not necessarily a blockchain-based one, like the question of language, the question of transaction costs and so on. It can be done through other forms. And but then you kind of say, no, but it's really hard to move towards that because the law won't enforce, and then you have a title on that. So my question, I'm mostly curious about, what do you think about the recent package from the European Union, the European Commission, proposing the pilot for market infrastructure in reality in blockchain based. So it seems that contradicts a little bit your prognosis that we as policymakers and bigger scholars won't be buying into that, but even in Europe kind of have this huge project for the next couple of years on moving the economy partially to the blockchain.
Yeah, I mean, I've followed developments in this space for the last few years, and there's no shortage of announcements that something will be piloted, that something will be tried, and ultimately, and I think this is the same that will happen here, ultimately one of two things happen. They are just quietly abandoned, those projects, or they are implemented in a way that everyone with a bit of sense can see is using blockchain technology without actually making use of their advantages. Now, I want to be absolutely clear. I think there's great potential in using technology to make our lives easier and to make legal interactions better. And this is happening already all the time. When I order my Uber to go to the airport, or when I take the tube in London, I interact not with people, I interact with computer systems. And they govern 99% of my interactions with other companies, with Traffic for London, my traffic provider here, with Uber, when I subscribe for Dropbox, and so on and so on. Almost everything is done digitally, and this is fantastic. However, the costs of using technological solutions. The marginal costs are very, very quickly rising. Everyone understands that, and Georg made the connection to self-driving cars. Elon Musk will confirm that it's very easy to get to 70% of a self-driving car. And we might even get very close to 99%. But the big question is, how much more effort is it to get the last percent done, right? And so the promise of blockchain technology seems to me, or perhaps one explanation seems to me to be that people look at going from, really inefficient paper stuff to 70% technology driven. And they extrapolate from that and say, well, just a little bit more and we get to 100% technology and we can get rid of all this inefficiency. And the reality is that as you try to solve more and more technologically, it gets incredibly more difficult. And we've seen that in so many areas of technology, with speech recognition, natural language understanding of computers, and so on. Try to have a conversation with Siri that is interesting, right? It's very easy to get to some point. It's almost always incredibly and infinitely more difficult to get to 100%. And the core problem with blockchain technology is if you don't get to 100%, it's useless.
Great. I fear we are at time or even over time already. So maybe this is a good moment to close the session and to thank Edmund for a fantastic talk with lots of guns to people's head. But I think the illustration, the argument was extremely clear, and I think everybody now has some time to digest the main argument and go back and read your paper. Can I just alert you, by the way, that we'll also post the talk online on our YouTube channel. So if you want to listen to it again, then you can always do so. Please do check our website for future events and for reports on events that we've had. It was great to have you all here with us. I'm sorry to close it now because there were some other questions in the chat, but I'm sure that you can email Edmund directly and he's happy to engage further on.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for having me, Georg, and thank you very much to all of you for taking the time to listen and for asking a lot of very interesting questions. Thank you very much. And yeah, if you want to, if you have any comments or questions, I'm very happy to discuss offline. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much and have a great day or evening, depending on where you are in the world. But it was great to see you all. Thanks so much and stay safe.
Thank you. Bye.